Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar sponsored by TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University. Um, my name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a professor of urban studies and planning and director of TREC. And along with Professor Chris Monsieur from civil engineering, we are the two instructors for the class that goes along with the seminar during the fall term. And then also the seminars are open to the public. So I'm doing our introduction. Sorry, I had to check my script. So our Friday transportation seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. They're usually held live on the Portland State University campus in downtown Portland, and also normally webcast, but obviously due to, oh, now I'm showing my screen. Thank you. Due to the COVID pandemic, this fall and winter, our seminars will be completely online. So this fall, we have a theme for the seminars, the theme being equity and transportation, recent research and practice. And going with that theme, I'm very happy to have Cara Vera, a transportation planner at Fair and Piers, presenting on some of the work that she's done, dignity-infused community engagement and Vision Zero in Los Angeles. Caro is a transportation planner at Fair and Piers, a transportation planning and engineering firm devoted to creating solutions that improve communities. She specializes in bicycle and pedestrian planning, equity, and community engagement, and has 10 years of experience in community organizing and engagement with communities of color. Before jumping into the seminar, I want to let you know about a couple upcoming ones on the following Fridays. Next week, we will have Margot Hill, who is a faculty member at Eastern Washington University, and she's going to be focusing on tribal mobility, accessibility, and social equity. And the week after that, and of course my slide decides not to, there we go. The week after that, we have Professor Tiara Bills from Wayne State University presenting about some case studies of travel demand analysis in transport disadvantaged communities. So hope that many of you can join us for those. Very quickly, introduction to GoToWebinar, which some of you may not be familiar with, and I know we've all been using Zoom a lot, so this is slightly different. Just a reminder that we are recording this, and we will be posting both the recording and the slides online afterwards, so you can view it again or share it with your colleagues. This webinar has been approved for 1 hour of professional development credits through AICP. Now, the presentation itself will be about 40 minutes. We'll hold Q&A to the end. To ask questions in the GoToWebinar format, there is a question box for you to type your question in. You can type them in at any time during the seminar, and then at the end, Chris and I will be looking through the questions and asking them of our speaker. I will remind the students, because we do want to prioritize your questions, if you are able to, please insert your course number into your display name. And I know it's not working for all of you, but if you can do it, please do so we can prioritize your questions. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Caro.
Great, thank you so much. I'll just take 1 second to start sharing my screen. Great. Let me, 1 second. Can you all see my screen? I can't seem to hide this.
Yeah, I can see your screen. Yeah, we can see it.
It's not
Um,
in presentation mode. I don't know if, I mean,
hmm,
it works, but
actually, yeah, that's a great point. Maybe if I put
If you go to the full screen mode, it should do
the
that.
there we
instead
go.
of, or can you all see the GoToWebinar system on your screen?
No, just the
Okay.
slide.
Okay, great. I just didn't want that to be a distraction. But great. In any case, thank you all so much. I just wanted to open up by thanking Jennifer and the team for inviting me to give this lecture. I wish it could happen in person. I'm really passionate about having dynamic and collective conversations, but we're amidst the pandemic and can't do that today. I was originally going to present with my colleague Kevin Okubiyo at LADOT, but he couldn't be here today, so I will do my best to incorporate both of our perspectives into this presentation. But as was mentioned, I'll be presenting on LADOT's dignity-infused community engagement strategy today. And before we get started, I did want to offer up a definition of what we define BZ Dice as. When the Fair and Peers and LADOT team was putting this together, we were really intentional about making sure that we include the perspectives and lived experiences of folks who live on these corridors in our project areas. So our definition is a planning process that intentionally and historically incorporates the viewpoints, lived experiences, and perspectives of those most impacted by a planning project, and it seeks to restore and atone for systemic and institutional injustices. So from the very beginning, we have an acknowledgement that there is a history of neglect and that there's systems of power, right? This is very different from what some community agencies typically do. I think LADOT was really committed to just being honest that they understand that there are systems of power like racism and white supremacy and classism that affect how our streets are built, and that we're seeking to atone through that through having an equitable and holistic engagement strategy. Another aspect of our definition says that a dignity-infused planning process involves community members in the process from the beginning, weaving both their perspectives and technical planning practices into a project. So VZ DICE is intended to be community-oriented and holistic. That means that community members have as much expertise as technical planning experts, right? In order to really create a safe street that reflects the needs of communities, they need to be at the table, but they also need to help us design and envision what a safe street is. So from the very beginning, VZ DICE has been intentional about weaving in the perspectives of community members and also bringing them along the ride as we're continuing or planning a project. The VZ DICE approach is super multifaceted and has a lot of elements that I will go through in depth for some. But from the very beginning, it was really important for us that our street team and our project team reflects the cultural values and faces that we see along our corridors. So for me personally, I am born and raised in South Central Los Angeles, and the bulk of our community engagement for the first phase of BZ Dice was in South Central LA. That's significant because I was able to develop relationships with community members on the street, with a local elotero, a street vendor, which I can share a little bit more about later, and was able to pick up on community dynamics that someone who's not from here or someone who isn't historically well-versed in engaging with Black and Brown communities might not be able to pick up. So our street team was composed of local residents who live along the corridor. It was also important for us to hire university fellows. We really wanted to engage the perspectives of students, but not always just typical planning students like myself. We wanted students from the creative arts. We wanted students who were historians or ethnic studies majors. Of course, we did include the typical transportation planner, like me. And we also included a call out for a public health fellow. So it was really important for us that we expand who we have in the room when we're planning our community engagement strategy. It was also extremely important to have accessibility partners that were built in from the project from the very beginning. So our team partnered with SCRSIL to serve as our QAQC, our quality assurance and quality control, to ensure that our events were mindful of accessibility and accessible to people with an array of disabilities. Another partner was Liberate, who is a language justice co-op based in LA, committed to getting rid of any barriers to access for folks who may speak different languages. And so all of our materials, depending on the community that we were in, were translated into the languages spoken along those corridors. And that was something that was intentional for every single step of the project. Another aspect of our approach is memorializing victims through the Rainbow Halo campaign. So it's not just about creating safe streets for the future, it's about acknowledging the lives that we've lost. And so VZ Dice is really committed to humanizing safe streets. A lot of the discourse often revolves around how long of a delay there will be, a bike lane blocking vehicle traffic in some people's perspectives. But for us, it was really important to take it back to the human approach and the human perspective of safe streets. Because at the end of the day, the reason that we're making these streets safer is because we've lost people. And so through the Rainbow Halo campaign, we install art pieces that create a rainbow light on the ground when someone's walking by. And there's also a plaque that honors the person who was killed at that intersection or along that corridor. And it tells you a little bit about them. And so that approach is really intentional about honoring human life, and especially the ones that we've lost. Another aspect of our approach is the social climate analysis. So the social climate analysis is intended to be done at the very beginning of the project. And so we use social science analysis methods to assess community context and conditions. We should not be planning for communities if we don't understand the local and cultural context. That's actually how we run into issues where we present the very end of a roadway design to the community and they do not like any of the proposed designs. So the social science methods that we use, I'll actually go into depth later. I have a slide devoted to, so I won't talk about it right now. Another aspect was that we have customized community engagement strategies for every single corridor. That means that we don't replicate the same strategy we did on one corridor on another. That means South Los Angeles is not the same as East Los Angeles, is not the same as North Hollywood, if you're familiar with LA. Another aspect of our work is that CBOs were brought on as thought partners and project partners. CBOs were not brought on and expected to just inform and execute engagement strategies that our team had come up with. They were the authors of the community engagement strategies, and we collectively found ways to deliver their scopes of work. So I do want to go a little bit more into detail into different aspects of our project, and that is the street team. So the ideal candidate for the street team had no prior experience. They probably had never heard of Vision Zero. We were less concerned with having people who were lifelong street advocates, because as much as those are great, we really wanted fresh perspectives. And also part of building a street team was that we can build a team of community advocates if we do this correctly. We knew that if we were able to train up our staff, at the end of the day, we would have a team of people who would go off and be passionate about safe streets in their community and hopefully show up to future Vision Zero or show up to future livable street meetings and be advocates in their own right. We were also super intentional about recruiting candidates who maybe have a history of facing barriers to employment or that we knew under any other circumstance would not be hired. So what that includes is people experiencing houselessness, people who are recently incarcerated, veterans, seniors, and people with a history of issues maintaining employment. The way that we actually found our street team is through this organization called People Assisting the Homeless that helps houseless folks find an array of different resources. That means that no one on our team probably knew what Vision Zero was when they showed up to the community interview, but they really wanted a job and were really passionate about learning. And for us, that was enough. We ended up hiring a street team composed of 15 local residents who either live in South LA or some of them even lived along Avalon Corridor, which I will discuss later. A big part of our street team strategy was to conduct bi-weekly trainings with them on Vision Zero. If we were going to focus on a specific corridor, our staff received 1 to 2 trainings and just role play community events per corridor. And we also included professional development activities. So this means that we weren't just committed to building a team of community advocates. We really wanted to make sure that when this project ended, we were setting up our street team members for success. So we helped them develop their resumes. We did practice interviews with them. and they had quarterly reviews where their progress was assessed. And it wasn't so much to be punitive, right, when we're doing quarterly reviews, but it was really to track the improvement and just areas of improvement, right, that our staff members were executing. And at the end of the day, our street team members were more passionate about Vision Zero than our whole team. They would go and conduct walk audits on their own. They would go and talk to their neighbors about Vision Zero, even when they weren't on the clock. So I think we did a pretty good job. And another thing to acknowledge is that hiring a street team or hiring folks who have no prior experience and maybe have a history of facing barriers to employment is not easy. That means that our team did become mental health advocates, right? Our team did become program managers. We really had to be creative with how we booked our street team because some of them didn't have phones or access to a computer. So we couldn't just send out a weekly email of your schedule for the week. We had to be really creative and intentional with building relationships and building trust with our street team. Another aspect, like I mentioned, are our university fellows. So we, as I mentioned, created 4 positions: the social science fellow, the creative arts fellow, the public health fellow, and the transportation planning fellow. So every position that you see highlighted in green is one that we were able to find a candidate for. Our goal with university fellows was that we needed to cast as wide a net as possible. We're in LA, so we're not just going to go to UCLA, we're not just going to go to USC planning programs. We're going to reach out to creative arts schools, we're going to reach out to local community colleges, we're going to reach out to Cal State universities, to private universities, and just make sure we cast a net as wide as possible to get the best candidates. And we didn't hire based on how much knowledge, again, someone had about Vision Zero. All of those things can be taught. We can teach someone about Vision Zero. We can teach someone about how to create a safe street. But we can't always teach someone how to be innovative, and we can't always teach someone to be passionate about community engagement. Those soft skills that people come with, where they can connect with a community resident, take a long time to build. And so it was really important for us to find candidates that already had those skills, and we can work on Vision Zero on the other end of it, right? And the goal was really to hire people from different disciplines because that expands our community engagement practice, and it also allows us to reach more people through innovative strategies. That means that we're not just going to have community meetings at the library. That doesn't work for everyone, especially if you don't provide childcare or food or transportation, which I can discuss later. Another and probably core aspect of our approach were community-based organizations, or CBOs for short. So in the very beginning stages of this project, we organized a CBO mixer where we made an invitation to all CBOs in the LA area. I think we emailed about 200 or 300 CBOs and had an open invitation to come learn about our new community engagement approach and think of joining our team. We really saw this as an opportunity to strengthen relationships with local community partners through intentional collaboration and partnership. So what that means is that everyone was invited. We didn't just invite transportation advocacy organizations. Although transportation advocacy organizations were and are on our team, it was important for us to cast as wide a net as possible because we're really trying to expand the reach of safe streets and expand the reach of community engagement. So we released the CBO application to join our team, and like I mentioned, no prior transportation advocacy or even experience needed. And all CBOs who applied were accepted. We were really intentional about building as big and robust a team because we also saw this as an opportunity for LADOT to deepen their relationships with local community organizations in the area. Like I mentioned, the goal is to bring on as many advocates as possible to expand our reach and create a team of community experts committed to safer streets. So the social climate analysis. This is a more formal research process than other aspects of our approach, but like I mentioned, the goal is really to assess and to understand the social and cultural factors on a project corridor and surrounding community. Ideally, this is an opportunity for planners and engineers to work with community members to identify meaningful ways to preserve community assets and address sociocultural barriers a proposed project might create. That means that we understand that when we go and enter a community that maybe is not too familiar with the department, they may have concerns about active transportation improvements being resources or tools for gentrification and displacement. So anticipating those conversations, our team would go out and conduct 3 rounds of walk audits with city staff, CBO partners, and community experts to really get a handle on a community. And our walk audits were actually supplemented by quantitative analysis, which included a community profile. So the community profile includes demographic information. What are the socioeconomic characteristics of the Avalon corridor in South Los Angeles? What's the collision history? We'd pull Locale Enviro 3.0 screen analysis just to know where the community lands. And we've conducted displacement analysis via an assessment of rent burden, which is actually a tool that City of LA has created, if you want to check it out. And the last thing, like I mentioned, was a qualitative assessment of existing community assets and amenities. And so part of the rounds of walk audits is also getting to know a community and thinking of great places to have community activations or community engagement events. So we're not only looking for what the existing amenities are or what we'd like to highlight in the community, we're also looking for what would create and make our community engagement strategy more dynamic. And that knowledge was really rooted in the community experts and CBO partners that either worked on the corridor or knew community residents and would also bring their base of residents to our walk audits. And so with that, you can't plan for a community without understanding local dynamics and reaching community members, especially now that we're in a time of a global pandemic. A lot of us are working from home. Our community engagement strategies have moved to be largely digital. And that presents an array of difficulties for people who may not have internet access or computer access. So that's something that's extremely important to keep in mind. And I encourage city agencies or even students who do demo projects to really think of, if I'm not familiar with this community, how can I leverage existing data sources to get to know it a little more? And with that, if you want vulnerable communities at the table, you have to start with dignity. The reason why the community engagement strategy for BZ DICE is so large and expansive is that we wanted as many partners at the table because this many partners haven't historically been at the table. Communities of color have not historically been engaged in the planning process, not in ways that they should be and not in ways that they were through the BZ DICE project. So BZ DICE was really an opportunity to begin anew, to develop relationships, and to really develop a DICE strategy that reflects the community. I did want to highlight Avalon Boulevard because this was our biggest effort for the BZ DICE project in 2019. Let me give you some context. Avalon Boulevard is a corridor in South Los Angeles. It is a very large corridor, and this one was 6 miles long. And so the corridor is primarily Black and Brown communities and a lot of low-income communities, and has a lot of public transportation activity and has a lot of bicyclists on the corridor who are primarily riding on the sidewalk. So for this one, LADOT collaboratively developed events that uplifted cross-racial and intergenerational perspectives on the Avalon Boulevard corridor. And our approach really focused on creating a series of culturally significant events that would engage residents. That means that we're meeting residents where they are. We're not asking them to meet us at the library. We, during AM and PM peak hours on the same day, are setting up tents and tables on all 4 legs of a really busy transportation intersection and bus stop and talking to residents. And if they engage with us, we make sure to offer incentives that make sense. Whether that means we offer them a free Metro tap card that has 1 or 2 rides, or whether that means we team up with a local street vendor to offer whatever snacks that vendor may give out. A lot of our efforts were grounded and led by the BZ Street team because when we weren't having events, the street team was going along the Avalon corridor and canvassing door to door and talking to residents about either our forthcoming events or just the changes that were going to come to Avalon Boulevard. Our strategy also engaged, like I mentioned, local street vendors, and we were intentional about reaching out and activating the local economy and providing local vendors the opportunity to participate in events that they might not otherwise be invited to. That means we didn't go to Subway, we went to a pupusa vendor on the corner who needed to be paid cash. Those are like the small sort of intricacies or complicated moments for, I think, city staff and consulting firms, because typically someone sends us an invoice and they give us their net 30 or their net 60. Sorry, there's a helicopter. And they're paid upon their net 30 or net 60. But when I speak about the elotero vendor, his name was Don Victor. And one situation that we encountered there is that we had given him a check written by one of our staff, and he had gone to 3 to 4 banks, and none of the banks would cash his check. And so when I spoke to him on the phone, he said he'd gone all over downtown LA. He'd been out there for like 2 to 3 hours looking for different banks when he lived very deep in South Central Los Angeles, which is pretty far from downtown LA, and no one would cash his check because he didn't have a bank account. They also didn't believe that his check was valid, right, at those different banks. And so those were small nuances and like intricate moments that you really don't confront until you're really in the crux of the work. And so from there on out, we made sure to pay that street vendor cash, and were flexible to paying him in modes that worked for him. And what that did was, of course, put a lot of money in his pocket and make sure that he was paid at the end of the day, but it also built trust between our team and a local community member on the corridor. Our approach for Avalon was largely community service oriented and implemented a community organizing approach to get people to our events. So Avalon Boulevard was a 35-day community engagement marathon. Some days we had 2 events a day, but we were really invested in trying out this pilot community engagement strategy of cyclical engagement. And the client at the time was really motivated by the passing of Nipsey Hussle, who had the saying that the marathon continues. And so for us, the marathon did continue. We had community engagement events every single day. The events looked different depending on the community partner that we were working with, or really what was going on in the community that day. So our very first event was a block party where we gave out ice cream from a local street vendor because it was a hot day in LA. We just wanted to make a premiere and let people know that we would be on the corridor for the next 35 days. Another one was a faith-based event where we collaborated with an array of churches in South Central Los Angeles and offered lunch to all of those churches, and then asked them to either listen to our presentation about Vision Zero, tell us what they thought about safe streets, or tell us where the streets aren't safe, and to please take our survey at the end. And it was important even back then to have a digital and in-person strategy because not everyone can attend all of our events. So we also had an Instagram live discussion on traffic violence in South Los Angeles. And as I mentioned, we canvassed our businesses and we canvassed residents when we weren't actually having events. But we also attended a bike to school day in 4 to 5 high schools in South Central LA and made sure that those students were also aware of the changes coming to their corridor. We wanted to make sure that this was intergenerational. We wanted to make sure that we were engaging different kinds of residents, that we weren't just engaging young people, that we weren't just engaging millennials or people with internet access. So we also had a Mother's Day Zumba that really targeted mothers along the corridor. And one of our most famous, or I would say well-attended events was Eloteros for Vision Zero, which I'll discuss in a second. And so it was really important for our events to be dynamic and for not all of them to be the same. Of course, at the end of the day, what you're doing at those community engagement events is the same. You're either disseminating information, you're either getting community feedback, you're either distributing a survey. But it's important to offer different types of opportunities for communities to offer that feedback, because the after church lunch might not work for our communities who don't go to church, right? And the bus stop strategy is not going to work for people who drive. So it's extremely important to have different kinds of events to get folks involved in the conversation. And so one of our most successful events was what we call the Elotero Support Vision Zero event. And so this Elotero, I spoke to him outside of a hub space that the project was renting because I saw that he was biking along the corridor and he sold raspados and corn on the cob. Raspados are ices. And so I just asked him if he would be interested in partnering with us. I told him what we were doing, and he let me know that he'd been biking Avalon for over 20 years. He's seen how unsafe the streets was, and he was in, and he was committed to partnering with us on this project. And that ended up being one of the most effective engagement strategies along the corridor. We would average 150 to 200 surveys for every single event that we had with the street vendor. Because of course people love free stuff, but also like we were working with a community partner that people knew on the corridor, and that reflected the community residents. It wasn't people who were coming from the outside and asking community residents to participate. We were working with their own neighbors to execute the strategy. And so these are just some pictures of children at our events. The child in the middle is wearing VZ swag. All of our swag was uniquely designed by our Fair and Peers team. And we made sure that we had different kinds of swag that reflected community and that they would use. So we had water bottles, hats, bike lights, shirts, tote bags. It was really about developing a unique and innovative engagement strategy that brings different people to the table. And of course, kids love safe streets and are one of our main targets as young people get hit at higher rates. This all culminated in SLOW, or what is also known as the South LA Open House. This open house had about 1,100 attendees, and by the time residents attended our open house, they came with their water bottle, they came with their Vision Zero hat, and knew what was coming to Avalon and knew what they wanted to see that was different or that worked. And so we involved different LADOT departments to talk about an array of local projects that were happening in South Central Los Angeles. And so the mural that you see all the way in the back was created by our Creative Arts Fellow in partnership with a local artist in South Los Angeles. And what happened is that young people painted the mural. The artist had already created the outlines, and young children and just anyone who walked upon us had the opportunity to paint the mural as they would saw fit. And so the theme of the mural was Safe Streets. At the end of our 35 days of engagement, we had engaged about 12,000 people. So this was one of the most successful, both open houses, but also community engagement strategies that the department has executed. And why was it successful? It incorporated community residents, it tried innovative strategies, but it also met residents where they were. The outreach that we used for the open house was a community organizing strategy. We were phone banking, we were building a database of emails and community contacts to make sure that residents remembered that there was an open house, but also by the end of those 35 days, community residents knew us and our street team members practically by name because they'd seen us on the corridor day and night on different legs of the corridor. And at the end of the day, we had about 700 resident surveys submitted. And these are just a few pictures from our open house. We ended up designing unique swag for the open house that had all big streets in South Central Los Angeles, some of them being Vision Zero priority corridors, and they were given out for free along with tote bags that you see the young girl on the left wearing. The picture on just to the right of those young girls is a community mural that we ended up creating with residents. You see a lot of butterflies and hearts and suns, and you even see some young people's names that they wrote when they were creating the mural. And at the end of the day, this was also one of our most unique and successful strategies because community members were able to draw how they were reflected in a street that was safe. You see below that there's a picture of our open house. It was at capacity most of the night. And we also have children's booths with some adults at our open house. So the biggest, I think, opportunity and outcome of Avalon Boulevard was just overwhelming community support for the improvements that were coming to the corridor. When I was conducting, engagement on the corridor as well, and we would tell residents about the improvements that were coming, they would say, oh, I have metal in my knee because I was hit by a car on Avalon. Or, oh, do you see that fire hydrant? It's new because a car crashed into it just 2 weeks ago. Or like, oh, that's why I don't ride my bike anymore because I've gotten hit twice or so many times. And so this was really different in the fact that on some public projects, you just have overwhelming opposition, especially in just historically affluent and more well-resourced communities. But this community had really been starved for investment. And so when it came that they were seeing that LADOT and the city were going to invest in their community, they were super excited about it. And through our community survey, we learned that 90% of residents who took our survey supported the implementation of a bike lane on Avalon Boulevard. And that's huge. It's a bit of a battleground in LA sometimes to get active transportation improvements installed. You do not typically get 90% of community support for a bike lane. Another aspect was that 96% of them supported the installation of more crosswalks and signals along Avalon Boulevard. One of the big issues that we saw was that there weren't enough pedestrian crossings along the corridor. And something that I think is just the biggest takeaway or the biggest surprise for our project team was that 78% of people were willing to add 3 or more minutes to their trips on Avalon Boulevard if they knew that it would improve safety conditions. So typically in LA, and I imagine in many communities, this is one of the most contentious parts of a project. Is this going to delay my travel? Am I going to have to wait 2 more minutes at an intersection? But in this scenario, because of our community engagement strategy and how dynamic it was, residents were willing to do that. And so Avalon Boulevard has actually seen the safety improvements be installed now. I have yet to get a chance because of this pandemic to go out there and see the safety improvements. But it's a project that I know LADOT is extremely proud of because it showed that the DICE strategy is successful, and it showed that you can get community residents to turn into advocates for safer streets. And if you want to engage communities, or when we're engaging communities historically siloed from the planning process, it requires unique, customized, and culturally relevant approaches. The person that you see on the right in the Los Angeles Vision Zero shirt is one of our street team members who only spoke Spanish. And she was in the process of learning English on the project, but that didn't stop her. She would speak to residents who only spoke English and build relationships with them. She was so passionate about what we were doing, and she lived along the Avalon corridor. And the picture on the left is Don Victor and his wife, who would graciously supply us with an endless supply of corn on the cob and raspados for community residents. So for the numbers at a glance for our events, or excuse me, numbers at a glance for VZ DICE in total, we attended 55 events. We curated some, but a lot of them were either a Ciclavia event or just a local community event that was happening that we wanted to have a presence at. At the end of the day, we engaged 17,670 residents in the city of LA. We worked with 36 local vendors and artists, and we've hired 42 community members directly. And the outcomes that we've seen with VZ DICE are really phenomenal, and it's been unique to see a city agency incorporate such a dynamic and holistic strategy, but it's also been demonstrated that it works. And it's also, in this time and age that we're in today, extremely important that our community engagement strategies as practitioners incorporate racial justice, incorporate community residents, and incorporate CBOs, not just as people who can give us their feedback, but as community partners. And it's also important to emphasize that all of those opportunities where we partnered with people were paid. This project was committed to building trust with community members and also paying people for their labor, because just as consultants and just as planners at city agencies are paid, our community experts deserve to have the same amount of respect and dignity as well. So the key takeaways for VZ DICE are: community engagement should be culturally relevant and reflect the community being served. Transportation projects can negatively impact communities if residents aren't involved in the community engagement process. And we've seen this throughout history. And we learned that from our social science fellow who was a historian. We need to partner, build, and pay community partners because they're local experts. And community engagement requires building trust, starting with a willingness to innovate, intervene, and invest. And when we say intervene, that means that as we held our community engagement events, we would assess them for how successful they were, how we felt the community interacted with us, and what we could do better. This was a very dynamic approach that shifted as needed, which also I think requires time and a willingness to move and shift when things don't work out, which I know is sometimes difficult for city staff to do. And lastly, it's the city staff and consulting team's responsibility to build trust with community. It is not the community's responsibility to come to us in efforts to build trust. Even if we are solely representatives of a city agency, we're still responsible for building trust. We're still responsible to listening when we're talking about improvements on a corridor and someone wants to talk about the fact that the trash hasn't been picked up in their community for ages. One strategy that you can incorporate when doing community engagement events, and this is for in-person events, is to have resource tables from different city agencies and from community-based organizations that can help people facing displacement, that can help people needing educational resources for their young ones, and that can just help people experiencing houselessness. I think the longer that list of community resource table that you have, the more residents you can serve. And what that does is that shows community residents that we're invested in improving their quality of life and livelihood, even if it doesn't directly start with a bike lane. The bike lane is really just the beginning. Active transportation improvements are really just the beginning, but this is about improving our city completely and holistically, but starting with people who need it the most. Thank you.
Okay, that was amazing. Loved it. Thank you. We've got a number of good questions here that I am going to, let's see. Sorry, I got distracted by it wanting me to share my screen, which I'm not going to do yet. I'm going to start off with a couple of the sort of the larger picture questions, and that was if you could explain a little bit more of how much the engagement was about building community support for a plan that was already maybe done or close to done, or how much was it about actually developing the plan with the community?
Yeah, it really depended on the project that we were working on. For Avalon Boulevard, those improvements had been scoped for a pretty long time through the council district. So Council District 8 in Los Angeles is Marquise Harris Dawson. And for, actually, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of the Broadway project, which is another one where it was already pre-built, but there had been community engagement. But I'll go back to Avalon. Avalon is one project where unfortunately the design had already been prepared and they'd already won funding for it. So this came, and that also is about being transparent, right? I think BZ Dice developed in response to difficulties that the department has faced at times with Vision Zero and their community engagement strategy. So we were really starting this in 2019. It was being developed in 2018. So that means that it started when some projects had already been designed. In the next iteration of BZ Dice, I believe, I wish Kevin was on this call, but I believe that their goal is to start some projects from the beginning. But even right now, I know that LADOT is conducting engagement and asking residents what they'd like to see before starting the design process. But Farron Piers is not the consultant on that project.
And I think that gets a little bit at the next question, and you could add if you want to, or again, this might have been one that Kevin could answer more directly, but what was the impetus from LADOT to invest in this big community effort?
In BZ Dice?
Yeah.
As I mentioned, I think they really wanted to invest and think big picture for how they conduct equitable engagement. Los Angeles is an extremely diverse city, but it also comes with an array of challenges, those being around socioeconomic opportunities that our residents have. So this was really an opportunity to develop an equitable strategy that can be a model for the country. A lot of cities look to LA to see how we conduct equitable community engagement, and that's the perfect opportunity to really envision how we would conduct equitable engagement. And at the time, the planner had a big history of community organizing in Los Angeles and community engagement. So she brought that expertise to the department and really developed and expanded this approach.
Great. Yeah, there's a sort of a follow-up question on maybe you could talk a little bit about the difference between the or how much engagement was with business owners along the corridor, and was their reaction different than the community, or what was the synergy between those two?
Yeah. Let me think about this for a second. I don't recall hearing any opposition from business residents regarding the improvements that were coming to the corridor, but also a lot of the businesses along Avalon Boulevard have parking lots. So they're not going to be too concerned if we're removing a lane or installing a bike lane because they have parking at their establishments. But all businesses along the corridor were canvassed just to let them know about our events or invite them. And of course, we just hired local businesses for our events as well.
Great, thanks.
We have a question on here that basically gets at that gentrification issue. Like when you invest in a corridor like this, there's that risk. And so if you could maybe talk through that a little bit, what are the things that maybe you guys considered, or?
Yeah, so that was also a new aspect of LADOT's approach, and that's something that's still being refined. But we partnered with an organization in the Bay Area called Just Cities that did a displacement assessment of different communities in Los Angeles through an array of demographic variables. Of course, rent burden, population change over time, educational change over time, meaning like, are people who are more educated moving into the community? What other variables were used? I think those were the core. It was rent burden, income change over time, like race change, ethnicity, population change over time, and just education change over time, to really just give us a snapshot of have these communities changed. And that's, I think, what's so difficult about measuring and tracking displacement, is that our variables are collected every few years. So if it has happened, we're probably a little late in the game. But I think LADOT is trying to get, and still really working on an understanding of what displacement looks like as it's happening in communities that they serve. But that also doesn't mean that they are unwilling to have conversations with residents about displacement. As we mentioned, for some planners, that's probably not directly related to our work. But if a community resident comes to us with that concern, it's our responsibility to listen and take it back to our team.
All right, this next question starts with thanks for the amazing and inspiring presentation, one of the best presentations at Trek ever. So I wanted to make sure you knew that. So questions about the funding of the street team community members. So this is kind of in the details. Were they paid employed full time? Were they paid minimum wage? They get paid for the duration, or just when they participated on the corridor projects?
That's a great question. They were paid the whole time, and so we had different tiers depending upon that staff member's leadership. So we had a $15 tier, an $18 tier, and a $20 tier. Depending on, if you started at 15, that didn't mean you couldn't work up to be project leader and eventually make $20 an hour. But they were paid for all meetings that they attended, even if there was no engagement events happening, and they were paid for all of their, all of their attendance at community engagement events. That means that they were paid when they worked. So we didn't pay them. Imagine there was a period where there was no work, for example, they weren't paid. They weren't working.
Okay, we're tag teaming the questions as they're streaming in here. So here's one. As an outsider of a community, how would you suggest one to engage the community? Should the entity conduct wholesome background research of the community? Should the entity seek to create smaller engagement programs? But sort of that whole outsider coming into a community issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely always recommend beginning with a demographic profile of the community. And that's if you really know absolutely nothing, which it happens, right? If you were to send me to Burbank, I don't know about that community. I would need to do work to get to know it. So I always recommend pulling a demographic profile and just doing some research, if you don't know, on who the community leaders and community-based organizations are. Sometimes community-based organizations are open to doing informational interviews about the work that they do and the populations that they serve, but also sometimes that information is readily available on their website. A way to do that is to partner with a community-based organization. Say that you have an active transportation improvement project coming to that area. Reach out, even if it's a cold reach out. This is something that I've done too, to that community-based organization and let them know what you're working on and if they're open to discussing opportunities to partner. Of course, all of those CBOs should always be compensated for the labor that they're doing. And sometimes they're willing to offer their base of residents because they sometimes nonprofits have like bases of leaders, right? Or bases of just community residents that they engage and work with. They can offer them up to partake in your workshop. And of course, if it's something like a focus group, those members should be paid as well.
That's a kind of an interesting question. So how might you think that these strategies would could be adapted if, say, the project was in a wealthier area, but the place where you wanted to get outreach was kind of like using through the corridor. So they weren't in the corridor, but in supporting or connecting areas.
Do you mean, okay, how to conduct engagement in a wealthier area, or?
So sort of the project is the question says so the bus goes through a wealthy neighborhood. How do you engage maybe the people that are using the transit service that are going through the wealthy neighborhood who may be opposed to the project?
So you're saying that people who ride public transit are opposed to the project, but don't live there?
No, I think
Yeah.
it's getting at that sometimes the users of the street are not people who live in the neighborhood.
Right.
So the
Yeah,
users
thanks.
of the street may be more economically diverse than the people who live nearby. I think that's what it was getting at.
That's a great question. It's hard to find a way to, like a clear way to engage people who are in a vehicle and do not live along the corridor. We don't know where they're going. At times, I think a transit-based strategy could be useful. It's likely some people who take transit in the area, of course, live on it, but there's also like rapid buses that go across the city. So I would probably try a transit-based strategy. It's possible they also frequent the local businesses. Or go through the corridor for a farmer's market. So I would try to find opportunities, or even if there is like a restaurant in the area that has people who don't live there attend, I would ask them if they're willing to partner with you for having you stand outside of their business and establishment to conduct surveys or just ask for opinions. And if you do happen to come upon someone who's like, yeah, I actually don't live here, I live in X area, you can ask them for their information. And obviously this approach is going to take more work, but there's a snowballing strategy, right? And say like, do you anyone else who drives through this corridor that would be interested in talking to me? And through that, you could possibly build even a focus group, right, of people who don't live in the corridor, or sorry, in the project area and are willing to speak to you, and compensate those attendees and have a small sample size. Obviously, it's not the same or as simple as people on the corridor, but it could still be a strategy where you can get to know some of those perspectives.
Right.
Great.
Another question. I am curious to hear more about how your team stepped into unexpected roles, such as mental health advocates. How did you adapt to this and handle conflicts or tension that came up through employing vulnerable populations?
Yeah, we had a conflict resolution workshop for our street team because we had seen conflicts come up with our team. And a lot of that comes through my community organizing background, and just my own personal mental health advocacy. But it also, I think everyone on our team, regardless of their experience, was really willing to lean in and be flexible because we knew that we were doing something that probably hasn't been done, and had a lot of different community partners at the table. This isn't a typical collaboration for a data analysis project between Fair and Peers and LADOT that's more clean cut, right? We knew that we were dealing with situations or just didn't know what our street team members were handling. So we would schedule individual check-ins with our street team members. And for those who needed more support, we would either try to find them more external resources, either through PATH or other avenues, or really just be flexible with them. That means at times we would have people who in our street team meetings would just go off, and maybe start crying or just maybe start an argument with a staff member. And we would intervene in that moment and just pull that staff member aside and listen to what their concerns were. And after that moment had passed, just let them know that if they do have a concern like that in the future, they can bring it directly to their staff. And that goes with people maybe not having been in a professional environment and just not being aware that you're not supposed to do that. And it really was on our team to have that flexibility and understanding that we were hiring people who had faced barriers to employment in the past. So you really have to be flexible, you have to be willing to adapt, and you have to think on your toes, which we don't always do, but it's an extremely important skill in community engagement and community organizing.
I'm going to, Chris, I don't know if you had a question lined up, but I was going to suggest just one last
One last question. Okay.
And I thought there's one on here that what was one of your favorite aspects of the experience? I thought would be a good one to
Great. Yeah.
wrap up on.
Awesome. I love that question. When I became a transportation planner, it's a long story, but it was through gentrification. I saw my city was being gentrified, but also my mother grew up on the bus and rode from South Los Angeles to East Los Angeles, and I saw how difficult of an experience that was. And I've also seen just how dangerous our streets are in South LA. So it really was my pride and joy to help develop a unique and accessible and culturally relevant strategy for a community that I grew up in. And I was able to see the 1,100 people at the open house, and I was able to see even days after I was walking and I saw someone wearing the shirt. So like that was my pride and joy, and I knew that I'd been a part of a team that really affected folks in the community, and that even folks in the community were prideful enough to wear those shirts, which are also super cool, right? And that's part of the strategy. We have to make things cool and like visually compelling. But that was my most favorite part, to know that I was just a part of a team that did that.
All right. I'm trying to do too many things at once. I'm trying to share my screen and thank our speaker. This was amazing. I'm so excited. I'm definitely want to share this out. Once we have the video, we will share the link out, and it gets emailed to everyone who did sign up as well. So you can watch it again and share it, and I would highly recommend it. So we'll give you some virtual applause here, and then let's see. I thought I was sharing my screen. I thought I was.
Yeah, we can see it, Jennifer.
You can see it, but it's not in display. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. I particularly want to thank Caro for her presentation. And I just want to remind everyone, we've got a great lineup coming ahead. Sign up for our newsletter if you don't already get it. And we have some other events as well. And right after this, when you sign off, you're going to get a quick survey to fill out to give us some feedback. We really appreciate that. It shouldn't take very long. And with that, I will say goodbye to everyone.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Goodbye.
Bye.